Types of speciation. Speciation might be a long word, but it's a pretty simple idea that new species are being created. And a species is a group of organisms that are similar and have the ability to produce fertile offspring. So basically, it is a group of organisms that can have babies that are able to have babies, which is what being fertile is. In order to produce new species, we have to have some sort of barrier that is separating a population. And we call this reproductive isolation, which is the loss of ability to interbreed by two isolated groups. There are many different types of barriers, such as geographic isolation, behavioral isolation, or timing isolation, sometimes called temporal. And we're mostly going to focus on geographic isolation because that is more common. Behavioral isolation is when organisms have different mating calls or different types of camouflage, maybe in birds or insects, different courtship behaviors such as the dances that they do in order to attract a mate. And timing means that they mate at different times of the year. This is a sample question that you might see taken from a previous SOL about timing isolation. And so it says, which frog species would be most likely to interbreed? And we want to look for species that have very close mating periods. So if you look here, these two lines are very close together, and that's the leopard frog and peeper frog, so your answer should be A. Geographic isolation is when a population is separated by a natural barrier. Sometimes this can be newly formed, sometimes it can be accidental, such as a mountain, river, or desert. And it's when the gene pool becomes isolated because of whatever barrier is there. So because they are no longer able to breed, those differences build up in the population until they become so different that they can no longer produce fertile offspring together, at which point we call them different species. So this example is about a type of squirrel, and they had one common ancestor, but they ended up separated into two groups on either side of the Grand Canyon, and you'll see that over time their populations have changed. One of them has much darker coloring on the left, whereas this one on the right is much lighter. They have whiter fur on their stomachs, and they are now two different species. Adaptive radiation can be one result of different types of isolation. And adaptive radiation is when one species evolves into a number of different species, and they each occupy a new environment. Here is an example of cichlid fish. They have a second set of jaws, and what this diagram is showing you is that they've all developed to form different roles in terms of what they eat. Darwin's finches are another example of adaptive radiation. So again, we have one species becoming many. Our ancestral ground finch would have probably been on the mainland of South America, but that mainland finch got blown off course, we think probably from a storm or something like that, and they ended up on the Galapagos. Based on what food sources were available on the different tiny islands, determine which finch beaks were best in that area. So because of their isolation from each other, they ended up being different species. Another example that we are dealing with today of speciation is bacterial resistance to antibiotics. Because antibiotics are very prevalent in our society today, like you can go to the doctor whenever you're sick and they'll just give you a prescription for antibiotics. Also, a lot of the meat that we consume is given antibiotics because of the way that we raise those animals. Antibiotics are everywhere. And what's happening is that there are strains being developed that are resistant, so the medication doesn't work on them. Because as we are taking antibiotics, there are going to end up being some bacteria that are resistant naturally. Like could be a mutation, could just be maybe a duplication of a gene, they're naturally resistant. So they're able to survive while the other bacteria die off, and now they have all this extra space and food, and so they are best suited for that environment. They will survive and reproduce. So remember, it's not that they are changing when you take antibiotics, but some bacteria are naturally stronger or more resistant to others. Over time, we see new species of bacteria appear, such as MRSA. If you play sports, they talk about MRSA a lot because you're more at risk for infection due to often having open cuts and things like that. MRSA stands for methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. So it's a staph infection, and methicillin is an antibiotic that they used to always give to treat staph infections, but now we see that it is becoming more resistant. And so that medication no longer works on this type of bacteria. They're often called superbugs because the really scary part is that MRSA is now often resistant to other types of antibiotics as well. Another example are insects resistant to DDT. In many cases in conventional farming, they just spray the whole field now with pesticide because they can engineer plants that are resistant to that pesticide so that it doesn't harm the actual plants. But because we use it so often, there, due to evolution, will be insects that are more resistant, and so they will be able to survive and reproduce. And then we end up over time with a whole species that is resistant to that chemical. Industrial Revolution, I'm sure you learned about this in middle school. When we had increased amounts of pollution due to the Industrial Revolution and the building of factories and a lot of air pollution, soot and all kinds of nasty stuff from the factories accumulated on the trees, and that made those trees much darker. And so because of this change, the white moths started to get eaten more frequently, and the black moths were now better suited, so they would survive and reproduce, and over many, many generations, we would see far less white moths being born. We talked about tempos of speciation in class when we talked about what a theory is, but just as a quick reminder, there are two theories for how quickly evolution happens. On the left side, this is gradualism, where we have slow, continuous change. The population is constantly evolving, and we see very tiny changes until eventually we get different species. Whereas on the right, we have punctuated equilibrium, where we have long periods of no change and then very short, rapid periods of change. And they can be caused by different environmental events. And it really depends on what organism or situation we're talking about. Both of these models could be true depending on the situation. Lastly, these are different types of graphs you'll see for variation. We start with our original population, and what this is showing is a range of phenotypes or physical appearance. So in this example, we have snail shells, very lightly colored to very darkly colored. And due to different selection pressures, like if more predators are introduced to the area, or like the peppered moth situation where their environment is changing due to human activities, we can see changes in that population's phenotype. Our first type is called stabilizing selection. Stabilizing because we group up in one point. So usually the intermediate phenotype, as you see here, our evolved population is going to be mostly that middle shade. In directional selection, the population is going to shift to one side or the other. In this case, it is going to a darker colored shell. So we move in one direction. And diversifying selection is when we get two humps. So we have a concentration in the lighter end and a concentration in the darker end, and nothing really in the middle.